July 2nd, 1937. The Pacific is supposed to be open sky and clean distance. Instead, it feels like a trap. Somewhere above that enormous sheet of water, Amelia Earhart is flying a Lockheed Electra toward a strip of land so small it barely deserves to be called an island at all. Howland Island is waiting ahead, along with fuel, safety, and the next step in a journey the world is already treating like history. Beside her is navigator Fred Noonan. Below them, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca is listening, scanning, waiting for a voice that sounds increasingly strained and increasingly close, but never close enough. Earhart's radio messages come through broken, urgent, almost ghostly. She says they must be near. She says they cannot see the ship. She gives a line of position. Then the sky keeps its answer to itself. That is the moment most people think they know. A famous aviator. A final flight. A navigational error. Fuel running low. A plane swallowed by the Pacific. But that is only the clean version of the story. The version that fits neatly into history books and short documentaries. Because the Amelia Earhart mystery never stayed clean. It spread across radio logs, search maps, witness claims, government records, false breakthroughs, national mythology, and one stubborn question that America has never been able to leave alone. If the ending was really that simple, this case would have died decades ago. It did not. Instead, Amelia Earhart became something rarer than a missing person. She became an open file inside the American imagination. Most people think the Amelia Earhart case is basically solved. The familiar version goes like this. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and navigator Fred Noonan failed to find Howland Island, ran low on fuel, and disappeared into the Pacific. It is neat, tragic, and easy to repeat. It also has the advantage of sounding reasonable. Earhart was attempting an around-the-world flight in a Lockheed Electra. Howland was notoriously small and difficult to spot. Her final radio messages suggested confusion, urgency, and shrinking margins. In official terms, that is enough to build a conclusion. But the real mystery is not just whether Amelia Earhart crashed. The real mystery is why this case never stayed inside that explanation. Because once you go back into the file, the story stops behaving like a closed aviation accident and starts behaving like something stranger, a disappearance built out of missing certainty. No body, no confirmed wreckage, no final proof strong enough to end the argument. Over time, that vacuum was filled by search efforts, radio questions, witness claims, island theories, capture theories, archival disputes, and decades of people trying to force one clean ending onto a case that refuses closure. So this is not just a story of a last flight. It is the story of how Amelia Earhart was transformed from a lost aviator into one of America's most durable open mysteries. And to understand that, we have to go back to the world before the disappearance, before the final transmission, before the search, before the theories. Back to the moment when Earhart was not yet a legend frozen in uncertainty, but a living symbol of modern courage, technology, and national ambition. Before Amelia Earhart became a disappearance, she was already a national symbol. By 1937, she was not simply a skilled pilot with a famous name. She was one of the most recognizable women in the United States, a figure standing at the intersection of aviation, celebrity, modernity, and American ambition. Her earlier achievements had already placed her in the public imagination as more than an aviator. She had crossed the Atlantic as a passenger in 1928, then became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932. She set additional records, wrote books, gave lectures, endorsed products, and built a public identity that mixed real competence with something larger, the feeling that she belonged to the future. That matters because Amelia Earhart did not enter her final flight as an obscure adventurer taking a private risk. She entered it as a carefully watched public figure in America that was deeply invested in aviation as a symbol of progress. Flight in the 1920s and 1930s was still dangerous, but it also carried enormous cultural force. Aviators were treated as proof that modern technology could push human limits outward. Earhart fit that mood perfectly. She was disciplined, photogenic, articulate, and unusually effective at turning aviation into a national story people could emotionally participate in. She did not just fly airplanes. She represented what a new kind of American woman could look like in public life. By the mid-1930s, that image had become tightly connected to one idea above all: the world flight. Her 1937 attempt to circumnavigate the globe near the equator was not just another record attempt. It was a grand modern project, one that promised scale, endurance, precision, and international spectacle. Purdue University had helped finance the Lockheed Electra she used for the journey, and the plane itself was modified with extra fuel capacity for long-distance flying. Her first attempt in March 1937 failed after an accident in Hawaii damaged the aircraft. But the mission was not abandoned. After repairs, Earhart began a second attempt on June 1st, 1937, this time flying eastward from Miami with Fred Noonan as navigator. Fred Noonan matters here because the official story of the disappearance rests heavily on the assumption that this was fundamentally a navigation problem. Noonan was not a random companion. He was a highly experienced navigator with serious long-range aviation credentials. In simple terms, this pairing made sense to the public. Earhart brought skill, fame, and resolve. Noonan brought navigational expertise. The aircraft was advanced for its day. The mission was ambitious, but it did not look reckless in the crude sense of the word. From the outside, the world flight looked like exactly the kind of challenge Earhart was built to meet. And that is part why the later disappearance hit so hard. People were not watching an obviously doomed stunt. They were watching a symbol of competence approach the finish line. By the time Earhart and Noonan reached Lae, New Guinea, they had already completed the overwhelming majority of the trip. The next leg, from Lae to Howland Island, was one of the most difficult. Howland was tiny, isolated, flat, and hard to see even under favorable conditions. To support the flight, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed offshore to provide communications, radio navigation support, and even visible smoke. On paper, the system was in place: a prepared aircraft, an experienced navigator, a support vessel, a destination known in advance. That is the version of the story people still instinctively trust. It feels organized. It feels modern. It feels like something that should have worked. And this is exactly where the mystery gains its force. Because the world before the disappearance was not chaotic. It was structured. It was planned. It was wrapped in confidence, technical preparation, and public expectation. Earhart was not vanishing from the margins of history. She was vanishing from the center of it. The reason this case has remained so durable is not only that she disappeared. It is that she disappeared from a story that looked, right up until the end, as if it belonged to triumph. The break begins long before silence. On July 2nd, 1937, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan took off from Lae, New Guinea, beginning the long flight toward Howland Island. The leg was one of the most demanding of the entire world flight. Thousands of miles over open Pacific, with a destination so small and flat that even being close would not guarantee seeing it. Their aircraft carried extra fuel, but fuel was not infinite, and the margin for navigation error over that distance was brutally small. The Itasca was waiting near Howland to assist with communications and to help them locate the island. On paper, the system still looked intact. In practice, the problem was already forming inside the radios. As the flight progressed, Earhart transmitted several messages that suggested she was moving toward the target, but struggling to connect cleanly with the ship. One of the central problems was not that nobody heard her at all. It was that communication between Earhart and the Itasca was incomplete, inconsistent, and increasingly frustrating. The ship could hear some of her messages, but she does not appear to have been receiving their replies in a reliable way. That distinction matters, because it turned what should have been a navigational support system into a one-sided stream of growing urgency. By the time Earhart's most famous final messages came through, the tone had changed. She reported that they must be near, but could not see the ship. Fuel was running low. Then came the transmission that has echoed through this case for decades. They were on the line 157-337. It was a navigational reference, a last effort to define position in a world that was rapidly becoming blank. It was not proof of safety. It was proof that they believed they were close enough for the final search to matter, and yet they still could not see the island. and the island cannot see them. This is the moment where the story stops feeling like a flight and starts feeling like a disappearance. Because what should have happened next is simple. They should have spotted Howland, or adjusted using two-way communication, or been found within a limited search area. Instead, the line between nearby and lost collapsed. Earhart's final known transmissions placed the aircraft in motion and still engaged in the search. But after that, nothing confirmed their location. No verified landing. No confirmed distress signal accepted as final proof. No wreckage recovered at the time. Just a plane carrying one of the most famous women in America, narrowing toward a destination, and then failing to cross the last invisible line between almost there and actually found. The U.S. government response was massive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized what became one of the largest air and sea searches in American history up to that point. The Navy and Coast Guard searched for more than 2 weeks across a huge area of the Pacific, but the effort found no confirmed trace of Earhart, Noonan, or the Electra. Officially, the simplest explanation hardened quickly. They had failed to locate Howland, run out of fuel, and gone down at sea. It was a reasonable conclusion, but it was still a conclusion built on absence. The search did not solve the mystery. It merely gave the mystery its first official shape, and that is the real break in the case. Not just that Amelia Earhart disappeared, but that the disappearance happened at the exact point where modern systems were supposed to prevent it. There was an aircraft, a navigator, a support ship, a radio trail, a destination, and then a void. The moment the search ended without an answer, the case crossed from accident into legend. From that point on, every missing detail will begin to do its own work. Every silence would attract interpretation. Every gap would invite a theory. The official explanation survives because it is plausible. But plausible is not the same thing as complete. What keeps the Amelia Earhart file open is not a single miracle clue that blows the case apart. It is the accumulation of unresolved friction inside the story. The more closely you look, the more you find details that do not necessarily disprove the crash and sink explanation, but do prevent it from closing the case with real finality. That distinction is everything. This mystery survives not because the official version is impossible, but because the evidence around it never became clean enough to end the argument. The first problem is the most obvious one, and still the most powerful. There was never confirmed physical proof. No verified wreckage from Earhart's aircraft was recovered in 1937. No body was found. No conclusive artifact surfaced at the time that could decisively anchor the aircraft to a final location near Howland Island. For a case this famous, that absence matters more than people sometimes admit. In many disappearances, the official explanation becomes stable because at some point the material world catches up to theory. Here, it never fully did. What remained was a highly reasonable scenario standing on top of a void. The second problem is the radio picture. Earhart's final transmissions have always sounded close enough to Howland to support the standard explanation, but not precise enough to close every doubt. The communication failures between Earhart and the Itasca were not minor technical annoyances. They were central to the event itself. The ship heard portions of her messages, but she does not appear to have been receiving their replies consistently. That means the final phase of the flight was shaped by partial information at exactly the moment when navigation and coordination mattered most. The third problem is what happened after the disappearance. The U.S. government mounted a large search, and the search found nothing conclusive. On one level, that supports the idea that the plane simply went down in the ocean. On another level, it created the very vacuum that allowed alternative theories to live. Because once a search of that scale ends empty, every later claim begins to gain psychological power. A castaway theory becomes harder to dismiss emotionally. A witness story becomes harder to ignore. Even weak evidence starts to look tempting when the official record closes without the one thing people instinctively want, a final, undeniable trace. The fourth problem is that this case has generated repeated breakthroughs that fail to settle anything. Over the decades, various artifacts, bones, photos, and possible wreckage claims have been presented as major developments. Some were intriguing. Some were heavily overstated. Some collapsed under scrutiny. This pattern matters because it reveals something deeper about the case, Amelia Earhart's disappearance does not just resist proof, it attracts projection. People keep trying to force a decisive ending onto a mystery that keeps producing, maybe almost not quite. And that leads to the fifth problem, which may be the most important of all. This is no longer just an aviation mystery. It is a national myth under permanent investigation. Once that happens, evidence is no longer judged in a clean vacuum. It gets pulled through hope, identity, media appetite, and the human hatred of empty endings. Amelia Earhart was too famous, too symbolic, and too culturally useful to disappear in a way the public could easily accept as ordinary. So the case kept expanding beyond its own facts. The result is a file where the hard evidence points in one direction, the unanswered gaps point in several others, and the absence itself has become part of the mystery. That is why the case remains open in the public mind. Not because one hidden clue has definitively overturned a mainstream explanation, but because the official story never became solid enough to silence everything around it. Once the case left the sky and entered public memory, it stopped being one mystery. It became several mysteries stacked on top of each other. One was the practical mystery of where Earhart and Fred Noonan actually ended up. Another was the evidentiary mystery of what, if anything, could ever prove it. And layered over both was a cultural mystery. Why this case keeps generating new confidence without ever producing a final answer. That is why the Amelia Earhart file has survived for nearly 9 decades. It is not built on one irresistible theory. It is built on competing explanations that each explain something, but none explain everything. The first and still most conservative explanation is the crash and sink theory. This is the mainstream view. Earhart and Noonan failed to locate Howland Island, ran low on fuel, and went down in the Pacific near their intended destination. On the surface, it remains the strongest explanation because it requires the fewest additional assumptions. Their final radio traffic suggests they were searching in the vicinity of Howland. The communication problems were real. The island was tiny. Fuel was limited. A long overwater flight, ending in navigational failure, is not mysterious in itself. It is tragic, but not improbable. The strength of this theory is its simplicity. Its weakness is that simplicity is not proof. No confirmed wreckage was recovered near Howland in 1937, and even modern efforts have failed to produce a conclusive find there. Again and again, promising developments have flared up only to collapse. The most reasonable theory may still be right, but it remains materially unfinished. The second major explanation is the Nikumaroro, or castaway, theory. This theory argues that Earhart and Noonan did not crash immediately into the open ocean near Howland, but instead reached Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro. Supporters point to a long-running body of circumstantial evidence, reported post-loss radio signals, artifacts found on the island, and the broader claim that a landing or near landing there would better explain why the case never produced the kind of immediate trace people expected. Its strength is that it offers an answer to the emotional vacuum of the case. Its weakness is that it still lacks definitive proof. Even where researchers argue that island evidence is suggestive, the case has never crossed the line from suggestive to conclusive. That is a recurring pattern with Amelia Earhart. Just enough to reopen the file, never enough to close it. Then there's a capture theory, the most dramatic and historically persistent of the major alternatives. In its broadest form, this theory claims Earhart and Noonan landed in the Marshall Islands or elsewhere under Japanese control and were captured. Versions of the story have circulated for decades and have obvious narrative power. They transform a navigational disappearance into a geopolitical secret. They convert uncertainty into concealment. They fit a pattern audiences often find irresistible. When evidence is missing, power must be hiding it. But this is also where caution matters most. The capture theory is compelling as story, yet much weaker as evidence. It has repeatedly drawn energy from rumor, disputed photos, and retrospective claims that do not decisively hold up under scrutiny. It survives because the case is unresolved, not because the case strongly points there. And that leaves us with the real structure of the Amelia Earhart mystery. The crash and sink explanation is the most economical and still the most broadly accepted. The Nikumaroro theory is the most durable alternative because it has gathered real, if inconclusive, strands of supporting material. The capture theory is the most culturally seductive because it gives the disappearance the shape of a hidden state drama. Each theory persists for a different reason. One is strongest on logic. One is strongest on unresolved possibility. One is strongest on narrative magnetism. And that is precisely why the case never settles. People are not arguing over one missing airplane. They are choosing between three different ways of living with uncertainty. One says the truth was ordinary, but never recovered. One says the truth left traces, but not enough. And one says the truth was buried on purpose. At some point, the Amelia Earhart case stops being only about aviation. It becomes a story about what people do when history leaves a hole. That is why this mystery has lasted so long. Amelia Earhart was not just a pilot who vanished. She was already one of the most celebrated aviators in the world, a public figure whose flying achievements and advocacy for women made her far larger than a single flight plan. Her disappearance did not erase that symbolic weight. It intensified it. The unresolved ending fused her record, her image, and her absence into one durable American myth. And myths behave differently from ordinary cases. An ordinary accident can be filed, explained, and eventually forgotten. A national symbol disappearing at the height of modern ambition is harder to bury. Amelia Earhart represented courage, progress, technological confidence, and a version of American identity that wanted to believe the future could be flown into existence. When someone like that vanishes without a confirmed ending, the public does not just lose a person. It loses narrative stability. The story no longer lands. It hovers. That may be the real reason the case keeps regenerating. People do not merely want to know where her plane went down. They want the story to become morally and emotionally complete. For some, the crash and sink explanation is enough because it restores order. For others, it feels too thin for a figure who had become so large in public life. That is where the alternative theories gain their power. They do not just offer different evidence. They offer different emotional endings: survival, struggle, captivity, concealment, unfinished heroism. The case also reveals something uncomfortable about modern media and memory. Not every mystery endures because the evidence gets stronger. Some endure because the uncertainty stays marketable. Earhart's disappearance has produced books, films, expeditions, archival arguments, photo controversies, and repeated cycles of possible breakthrough followed by collapse. That pattern tells us something important. An unsolved mystery can become self-sustaining inside culture. It keeps attracting attention not only because the truth is missing, but because the absence itself becomes valuable. And underneath all of that is a deeper human problem. We are bad at living with silence. When a story ends cleanly, we move on. When it ends with a gap, we start building around the gap. We fill it with logic, hope, fear, ideology, patriotism, suspicion, and fantasy. Amelia Earhart's disappearance has lasted because it sits at the intersection of all of them. It is an aviation mystery, yes, but it is also a case study in how modern societies turn uncertainty into legend, and how legend can keep a person alive long after evidence has failed to catch up. Somewhere in the Pacific, the last version of the truth still exists. Maybe it lies in deep water beyond easy reach. Maybe it was scattered, erased, or buried by time so completely that no expedition will ever recover it cleanly enough to end the argument forever. And that may be the final irony of the Amelia Earhart mystery. We live in an age that expects everything to be tracked, mapped, archived, and found. But this case was born at the edge of that certainty, in a world modern enough to attempt the impossible, yet still fragile enough to lose a plane, a navigator, and one of the most famous women in America into open sky and unfinished radio. So what really happened to Amelia Earhart? The most likely answer is still the simplest one. She and Fred Noonan never found Howland Island, ran out of fuel, and disappeared into the Pacific. But most likely is not the same as proved. And that narrow gap between reason and proof is exactly where this mystery has lived for nearly 90 years. Not in certainty, not in fantasy, but in the space between an explanation that makes sense and an ending the world has never been able to touch. That is why Amelia Earhart still matters. Not only because she vanished, but because the disappearance never stopped asking something of us. How much uncertainty can a culture tolerate before it turns absence into legend? How much proof do we need before we accept that history sometimes keeps its last page? If there's another mystery you want to open next, leave it in the comments. And if you are drawn to stories where the truth never sits neatly on the surface, subscribe to Black File Society.